The America's Democrats podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats, is made possible by contributions from our listeners. Want to do more? Go to americasdemocrats.org and click Donate. And thank you for allowing us to be your voice. And if you enjoy the show, please share it with your friends on Facebook and Twitter, and leave us a review on your favorite podcast app. This is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. I'm your host, Jim Cuddy. This week, veteran political insider John Lawrence on how reaching across the aisle can come at a cost for the Biden agenda. Historian Daniel Rodgers on why presidential moral leadership is more imperative than ever. And Bill Press with Washington Post reporter David Farenthold on what to read into investigations of Donald Trump and his businesses. Had enough of Fox News, the House Freedom Caucus, and Donald Trump? If you want the facts that you won't get from them or from the fake news sites of the alt-right, then stay tuned. Our sponsor, 21st Century Democrats, works hard to get everyday Democrats involved in returning our party to its roots and to success at the ballot box. Sit back and listen, then stand up and fight. And follow 21st Century Democrats on Facebook for all the latest progressive news. We're glad you can join us. After GOP senators blocked the creation of a January 6th commission, some Democrats are questioning the value of a bipartisan strategy to advance Biden's legislative agenda. John Lawrence has written extensively about Congress and American politics. He says that the political climate needed to make bipartisanship work is evaporating. And we say hello to John Lawrence, former chief of staff to Speaker Nancy Pelosi, and has written extensively about Congress and American politics. He's also the author of The Class of 74, Congress After Watergate and the Roots of Partisanship. John Lawrence, thanks so much for joining us today on the America's Democrats podcast.
Pleasure to be with you.
And our pleasure to have you with us. A piece that you recently wrote for the New York Times has this title, "You Don't Actually Have to Reach Across the Aisle, Mr. Biden." What is it that people need to understand about the limits of bipartisanship at this point in our political history?
There's nothing wrong with bipartisanship, and there's nothing wrong with trying to develop and pass legislation on a bipartisan basis. And I spent 38 years on Capitol Hill, and most of the legislation that I was involved with during that period of time on a wide variety of subjects was bipartisan. But in order to have a bipartisan relationship and a bipartisan majority in voting for legislation, you have to have a willing partner. And the circumstances of American politics today, both in terms of ideology, in terms of the parties, in terms of the arraignment of the parties within the Congress, particularly the close margins, the constant battling for the majority, the minority just has very little reason to play that role to support the legislative and policy objectives of the majority, particularly if they involve issues like a lot of money, raising taxes, or controversial topics. So a lot of the underlying conditions you would hope to find for bipartisanship really don't exist in contemporary American politics on Capitol Hill.
Well, and as you point out in the op-ed, there has been a time in our political history when bipartisanship actually worked. My memory would suggest that it's not that long ago. When was that, and what made that moment unique in terms of working across the aisle?
Yeah, so as I mentioned, I started working in Congress in 1975, and for much of the first 25 or 30 years, I think most of the legislation we developed was bipartisan. The reason for that was part of a larger issue that historians and political scientists study, but it basically boils down to the fact that the parties were not ideologically homogeneous at that point, as they are today. There were large numbers of areas of public policy that crossed party lines, and that majority that passed legislation was really formed out of that cross-party, bipartisan, ideological policy alliance on issues like civil rights or the environment or women's policy, consumer safety, even in conservative areas like government reform or deficit control. There were areas where there were commonalities between the liberal Republicans and liberal Democrats, or conservative Republicans and conservative Democrats. And though that was reflected in names that aren't well remembered today, by people who aren't students of American politics. On the Republican side, you had liberals and moderates like Jacob Javits from New York, Clifford Case from New Jersey, Mark Hatfield from Oregon, and Chuck Percy from Illinois. These were people they were Republicans. They believed in small government. They believed in lower taxes, but they also, on these policy-related issues, had a lot of commonalities with the majority of Democrats. Similarly, you had Democrats, particularly those in the old solid South, the Dixiecrat South, people like Richard Russell, or Long, or Howard Heflin, or a long time ago, Theodore Bilbo, people who were conservatives, but for reasons of history, for geography, for tradition, aligned themselves with the Democratic Party. And you could cross those lines as you were putting together political alliances and form majorities by seeking out those with common ideological and policy preferences in the other party. Again, that circumstance doesn't exist today because that kind of ideological diversity doesn't exist in the party, which is why in that New York Times piece, I referred to bipartisanship as the Sasquatch of American politics. It's rarely seen, but people are fervently looking for it anyway.
It's funny, as you're talking about this, and I started thinking about, the blue dog Democrats and blocks within different parties. You don't hear that anymore. They're either Republican or they're Democrat, and that's it. And it's where we used to see those crossovers. It just flat out doesn't seem to exist at all.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, if you just look at the number of blue dog Democrats has shrunk dramatically just over the last 10 or 15 years. And the group of Republicans who were the outliers, the Tea Party Freedom Caucus, those are overwhelmingly the dominant group within the Republican Party. Now, in part, those Republicans have won over a lot of those conservative Democratic seats, and that's why you have the close margins that you have. Before the South and the Southwest revitalized the Republican Party in the early 70s up to about 1980, the Democrats were the natural majority, and that's what both Democrats and Republicans believed. But once that Republican Party revitalized, and there was a vigorous party to which conservative Democrats could defect, the parties came into close parity, and they've been there ever since, fighting on policy issues and also fighting for majority control every 2 years.
Mm-hmm. Now, as you examine what you call the evaporation of opportunity to achieve cross-party legislation today, how did we get here? I mean, I think you would agree that this didn't just happen with the election of Donald Trump.
Oh, no. I mean, that I think is certainly the case. Some of this change, some of this realignment ideologically was actually by design. In the mid 20th century, there were actually quite a number of people who felt that one of the serious problems with American politics was that the parties were too heterogeneous, that the parties didn't really stand for anything. This very thing that we talk about as being highly desirable, an ideological range within the two parties, was targeted by people like the American groups like the American Political Science Association. The Republican Party actually created something in 1951 called the Committee to Explore Political Realignment. Franklin Roosevelt entered into a negotiation with Wendell Willkie right after they faced off in the 1940 presidential election to create a progressive Democratic Party and a conservative Republican Party, because people felt that the ambiguity in the ideology that in the parties left voters confused as to what they were getting when they voted for one particular party. But that realignment really changes partly as a result of civil rights in Vietnam, cultural changes that occur in the 1960s and the 1970s, that revitalization of the Republican Party that gives conservatives somewhere to go rather than being a dissident group within the Democratic Party. And that becomes reinforced with both the rise of a ideologically based media, which is both for technological and legal reasons able to emerge in the 1980s as it had not previously, and also the freeing up of money in politics that allows grassroots groups and special interest and advocacy grassroots organizations to not only promote their point of view, but really punish people who disagree with them. So all of those things, I think, were very important. Another feature, which I too complicated to get into here, but I talk about in my book in the class of 74, is that a lot of political issues got transformed into being questions of rights. And in the 1960s and 70s, whether that was women's rights or abortion rights or gun rights. And while it's easy to compromise when you're sort of fighting about the allocation of school funding or transportation projects, when you have to compromise on matters of fundamental rights that sometimes rise to the level of religiosity and moral values, it becomes much harder to cut the deals that are normal in the kind of bipartisan politics that we were used to in the earlier era.
Mm-hmm. We're speaking to John Lawrence, former chief of staff to Speaker Nancy Pelosi, and also the author of The Class of 74, Congress After Watergate and the Roots of Partisanship. John, if the Biden administration were to not give up, but let up on its goal to find legislative common ground, that implies a partisan approach. The word partisan, as we all know, often carries a negative connotation. How should we rethink that?
I don't think that partisan needs to have a negative connotation. Politics by its nature is a partisan business. As we used to say in Capitol Hill, if we all agreed with each other, one of us doesn't have to come to work the next day. The problem, I think, is less partisanship. I think it's the way in which partisanship is expressed. So having a genuine, honest disagreement with somebody about the way you proceed and on policy, and having that fought out on the principles and on the evidence, I think that's a healthy thing for a democracy, and particularly for a two-party democracy, where people want to be clear what they're voting for and what they expect and what they're going to hold elected officials accountable for. I think where it gets confused is when people equate a partisan political environment with the kind of vitriolic, derogatory, insulting kind of political rhetoric, which unfortunately has come to characterize the partisan divide in our politics. You know, we can really trace back to I think Newt Gingrich, and who very diligently undertook in the 1980s, when he was very much a backbencher, along with Frank Luntz and others, a way of redefining the way we talk about our political opponents. You know, you used to stand up on the floor and say, my distinguished colleague or my good friend. Now, Gingrich was telling people, don't do that. You know, use words like enemy and treason, and really try to differentiate your opponent in a way that stigmatizes them. And that's the rhetoric that people hate. I don't think people get angry about the fact that we have two different points of view about tax policy, or we have two different points of view about health policy or environmental regulation. Those are not inherently the things that people become furious about. But what alienates people is when they hear the kind of really insulting language, which has become all too commonplace in not only on the floor of Congress, but in our media and in our public speech. And I think we can address that a lot more easily than we can some of these structural underlying reasons why partisanship has become more characteristic of American politics.
Do you have a concern, though, that if progressive Democrats in office did indeed turn to a more partisan strategy, that it would push conservative Republicans and their explosive rhetoric further to the right?
Well, I'm not sure how much further to the right you could go than endorsing white supremacy and insurrection against the government. So I'm not too worried about that. I think this is very much the tone that is used. Nancy Pelosi, for whom I worked for 8 years, used to say that we'll seek common ground, but when we can't find common ground, we will stand our ground. And I think that's a reasonably good standard to use. Give the American people a clear choice, and then the American people can decide which they favor. And very importantly, they will then hold accountable the party that doesn't that has not provided any political support for a particular a policy or is responsible for a policy with which they disagree. I don't think you can be confrontational and be partisan and have public support. I don't think you can be extreme. But I think standing for policies that clearly differentiate you from another party and explaining those policies is not inherently alienating either to voters and doesn't necessarily provoke the other party to become more extreme. Although, again, I think the Democrats have Joe Biden certainly was characterized as and may well have been the most moderate of the Democrats in the 2020 election. He has spoken about bipartisanship and the need for coming together. He's brought Republican leaders down to the White House for consultation. It doesn't seem to have any moderating appeal whatsoever in terms of the Congressional Republican Party. In fact, they are continuing to go after their own people who show any inclination of being supportive. Where it may make a difference, however, is with the Republican electorate. And we do see that on some of the major policies that the president is working on, particularly those dealing with coronavirus and the economy, there is broad public support, even within Republicans, where a third and more of Republicans support the president's initiatives, even though there's virtually no support on Capitol Hill among Republicans.
And I will add that at the same time, Biden also speaks respectfully about everyone around him, whether the Republican or Democrat. And there's a big change from the previous 4 years. In terms of practicality, we hear over and over again that Biden needs bipartisan support to get anything done, especially with the filibuster in place. How can he get past that obstacle without watering down his agenda?
Well, that's going to be the trick, because, of course, if you go too far to try to accommodate your political opposition, you can end up with a very disenchanted political base on your own side and not necessarily gain much on the other side as well. And is it worth alienating your base to pick up one or two Republicans so that you can call the bill bipartisan? I think what President Biden's been doing is very interesting, and that is he's been trying to redefine bipartisanship as speaking to the question of broad public support in the country, rather than whether or not there is support specifically on votes on Capitol Hill, and whether he can sell that, whether or not that is credible, remains to be seen. I suspect that some of that broad support, that consensus, will evaporate when we get into more complicated and delicate issues, something like gun control or immigration. But for the moment, on the issues that I think are far away the most urgent for the American electorate, the economy, reopening the economy, creating jobs, controlling the coronavirus, there we see significant bipartisan support. And that's why the president is emphasizing that approach. When he gets to those other issues, though, I think you're right. I think he will have only two choices. One is there any way to fit some of these legislative initiatives, whether it's infrastructure or the social agenda that is in his America Families First bill, the third big bill, into the reconciliation process that, of course, would circumvent the filibuster, and to the extent to which it cannot fit in issues like voting rights, protection against gerrymandering, then I think he will have to confront ultimately the issue of changes in the filibuster. We have a ways to go before those votes have to occur, and I think that even among those recalcitrant Democrats like Manchin and Sisma, who are saying that they are not going to support the filibuster, if they see nothing but obstructionism from the Republicans as they deal with these more consensus-based issues that Republicans in the population do support, then I suspect those members will say, we're going to have to come up with some other strategy, because if the only alternative here, once you tell your political minority that if you don't support us, we're not going to do anything, in a closely held election where you have a 5-seat margin in the House and a tied Senate, you've just told the minority all they have to do is obstruct and nothing is going to happen. And we know that the American people are, whatever they voted for in 2020, they didn't vote for nothing happening. And so it's like telling the opposition in the baseball game that when your guys are going to steal base. You're never going to steal a base if they know you're going to do it. So to some extent, they will have to face that choice of modifying the filibuster unless they can see some evidence, and particularly evidence on some of these very broadly supported initiatives on the part of Republicans.
It promises to be a very interesting next few years for sure. John Lawrence, former chief of staff to Speaker Nancy Pelosi, joining us today. He's also the author of The Class of 74, Congress After Watergate and the Roots of Partisanship. John, thank you so much for your time with us today on the America's Democrats podcast. We'd love to have you back again soon.
Thanks so much. I really enjoyed it. I appreciate your having me.
And thank you. And this is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. We want you to sit back and listen to this americasdemocrats.org podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats. But we need you to stand up and fight. Do you want to get involved and help get our party back to its roots and to success at the ballot box? You can make your contribution to help us keep this show going and to elect Democrats who will stand up for democratic principles. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page.
This Social Security measure, I believe that we must pass legislation to provide medical care.
This is our tradition. When our grandparents came to America, it was the Democratic Party which said, welcome. It was the Democratic Party, the party of Roosevelt and Truman and Kennedy and others, who said that America belonged to all its people, not just a handful of the rich or a few giant corporations. That's why great leaders like FDR fought so hard for Social Security, and why JFK stood up to the insurance companies and their Republican allies to get Medicare. It's not just one thing, or one time, in one place. It's about a whole history of standing up to the Republicans and saying someone has to be on the side of regular working people in America, whether it's defending Social Security or just the way your loved ones are treated on the job. That's what the Democratic Party is all about. And that's why this message has been brought to you by the Democratic Party. Working people like you and me.
Paid for by 21st Century Democrats. Not authorized by any candidate or candidates committee. This is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. Coming up next, why America needs a new age of moral leadership and how Biden can provide it. But first, we turn to Jim Hightower, America's #1 populist, for his common sense commentary.
Corporate ideologues never cease blathering that government programs should be run like a business. Really? What business would they choose? Pharmaceutical profiteers? Big oil? Wall Street money manipulators? High-tech billionaires? Airline price gougers? The good news is that the great majority of people aren't buying this corporate blather. Instead, valuing institutions that prioritize the common good. Thus, by a 2-to-1 margin, Americans have stunned smug right-wing privatizers by specifically declaring in a recent poll that our U.S. Postal Service should not be run like a business. Indeed, an overwhelming majority, including half of Republicans, say mail delivery should be run as a, quote, public service, even if that costs more. In fact, having proven that this 246-year-old federal agency can consistently and efficiently deliver to 161 million homes and businesses day after day, it's time to let the agency's trusted, decentralized, well-trained workforce provide even more services for our communities. How about Postal Banking? Yes, the existing network of some 31,000 post offices in metro neighborhoods and small towns across America are perfectly situated and able to provide basic banking services to the 1 out of 4 of us who don't have or can't afford bank accounts. The giant banking chains ignore these millions, leaving them at the mercy of check-cashing exploiters and payday loan sharks. The post office can offer simple, honest banking, including small-dollar checking and savings accounts, very low-interest consumer loans, low-fee debit cards, etc. The goal of postal banking is not to maximize corporate profits, but public service. This is Jim Hightower saying, we the people own this public asset. To enable it to work even better for us, go to agrandalliance.org. The Hightower Radio Lowdown is brought to you by the Lowdown Happy Hour, now live streaming on Facebook from the Chat and Chew Cafe. So grab a libation, pull up a virtual chair, and join our freewheeling conversations with political mavericks, musical agitators, and kick-ass grassroots groups. The Lowdown Happy Hour will connect you to good trouble activists who are building people power across America. Get the Lowdown at hightowerlowdown.org.
This is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. Times of profound crisis call for presidents to step in with a moral vision that can inspire the nation. Historian Daniel Rodgers calls on President Biden to seize this moment of crisis and assert a vision that goes far beyond it. And we say hello to Daniel Rodgers, historian and professor emeritus at Princeton University, the author of several books, including Age of Fracture. Dan Rodgers, thanks for joining us today on the America's Democrats podcast.
You're welcome. It's great to be here.
And I should say welcome back. It's been a few years, but you are a previous guest of ours, of course. In a piece for The Atlantic titled America Desperately Needs a New Age of Moral Leadership, you write that the expression of moral leadership from the White House is actually a fairly new phenomenon. And you cite Theodore Roosevelt as the turning point. How did he change the script?
Well, let me go back just one piece, because I was asked to write that essay by the editors at The Atlantic because they wanted to know whether Joe Biden could possibly restore political language into the way that it was before Donald Trump took it over and shredded most of the moral elements out of it. And so I was interested to know how long had presidents sounded that sort of high moral tone that we associate with, say, a John Kennedy or George W. Bush, trying to call Americans out to their better self. And Biden had talked a lot about preaching to the soul of America or speaking to the soul of America, word he got from John Meacham, one of his script doctors. And the question was, could one change the language that markedly? And so I went back to look at presidential rhetoric, which I'd studied before in other cases. And I was really struck by how much Theodore Roosevelt changed the normal way in which presidents sounded. When presidents talked in public for a State of the Union or inaugural address, they basically talked facts. They talked about how the economy was doing. They talked about America's place in the world, but very, very much like the report that a CEO might give to his board of trustees. Nothing inspiring, nothing literary. And Roosevelt just changed that dramatically. He loved language. He was a man of words himself. Here's the way he begins his second inaugural address. Our people, the sons of the men of the Civil War, the sons of men who had iron in their blood, rejoice in the present and face the future high of heart and resolute of will. Now, I mean, the sort of over-the-top masculinity in that, there are many things one can put on Theodore Roosevelt that are deeply unattractive. But this was a new way of talking to the American public, and it caught on and has been was the norm until Donald Trump.
Yeah. There were a lot of norms until Donald Trump, I think.
That's very true.
Yeah. You also cite Franklin Roosevelt, John F. Kennedy as examples. Now, taking just one of those, Franklin Roosevelt, what values did he appeal to, and how was he actually received across the political spectrum?
I'll take the second point first. There's a kind of myth that a great president is a consensual president, that so far he has been uniformly adored and admired by people. That's a total historical myth. John Kennedy had bitter detractors. As we know, Abraham Lincoln had bitter detractors. Theodore Roosevelt and Franklin Roosevelt too. So it's not just a myth that people would go to the movies to hiss at Roosevelt. Maybe they didn't hiss at Roosevelt at the movies, but they sure were many unreconcilables in the 1930s. The question is whether presidents can change the frame of the way in which people talk about politics. And Theodore Roosevelt did a lot of that by talking a great deal about the public good, the national interests, about investments in people and investments in the nation's services and infrastructure, this sort of thing. And the second Roosevelt, used his platform, his radio platform, which was so important, to talk about simply the power of human beings to push back against fate. In the middle of the Depression, this was really important. We have nothing to fear but fear itself. It's the most memorable line that comes from that first inaugural. Nothing to fear but fear itself. But we have to, as he says, cast the money lenders out of the temples. We have to take back the reins of governments. We need to take the men who know only, quote, the rules of a generation of self-seekers and replace them with those with this public interest, because they have no vision. Where there is no vision, the people perish. That's straight out of the Old Testament. And most of the rhetoric of presidents up to that moment was biblical in this sense and sermonic in that sense.
Now, these presidents lived in a media environment that, this may be an understatement, is very different from our own. How significant is that in the ability of a president to convey their moral vision?
Well, that's really an important question. Presidents can talk all they want, but if they don't have a medium in which to reach their audiences, nothing happens. Theodore Roosevelt had the tabloid newspapers. He was the first president to love to give interviews with journalists. He set up the press conference room we now take for granted. He gave special access to people he was interested in talking to, et cetera, et cetera. And newspapers were on an enormous increasing trajectory right at that time. And Franklin Roosevelt did the same thing with radio. He wasn't the first president to talk on radio, but he knew how to use the radio medium. What Donald Trump did, I don't think he planned this, but he was the virtuoso of resentments. He could amass grievances and seem to speak to the grievances of lots and lots of relatively isolated people, and therefore the ways in which the sort of short takes of the Twitter messages, the short takes of his that he would put on the other forms of modern media were perfect, not for explaining to Americans what they needed to do, but for amplifying those who had grievances. And as I say, he was a virtuoso of grievance amplification.
We're speaking to Daniel Rodgers, historian and professor emeritus at Princeton University, author, of course, of several books, including Age of Fracture. Dan, you write that in normal times, citizens' souls don't ask for preaching, but that moments of crisis provide an opening. Why is that the case?
Well, most of the time, we tend to ignore who's in the White House. We don't typically even know who's in our congressional seat. Governors come and go. We don't actually want them to be talking in highfalutin language to us while we're going about our daily life, or whether they're struggling with more immediate sorts of things. So the idea that presidents can turn a corner in political culture just by what they say is historically untrue. What they can do is, in the middle of a moment when persons feel unsettled, they feel disturbed, they're anxious for answers, they're anxious for leadership. If they're very successful, they can speak right into that crisis and help to reframe it in ways that matter.
Now, turning to the present moment, we're surely in the midst of several crises. One, of course, is being the COVID-19 pandemic. How can and how should President Biden take advantage of this crisis to be hard on his own expression of what is moral?
The State of the Union message that we just heard, he worked really hard to lean into the COVID crisis. For him, it stands for the difference between truth-telling and falseness. It stands for the difference between competent government and incompetent and corrupt government. He makes it stand for the difference between those who really care about the public interest and those who care only about their private interests or their party interests. I think he did what a skillful president can do in this regard, and what we need to have done in the face of this crisis. But I also said in that piece that short-term crises don't make for long-term consequences, typically. I think about the way in which Obama was a master of the soaring, sermonic rhetoric, found that it wasn't working after a while. He could still be popular, but he couldn't move his agenda through Congress. And if Biden doubles down only on his ability to solve the COVID crisis, that will be the end of it. So I also said in that piece that any president who's going to be successful, with Biden in particular, needs to lean into longer crises and articulate something that Americans can hang on to there.
Mm-hmm. So at some point in time, it seems safe to assume at this point that COVID will move out of crisis status, but that hardly means we won't be facing more enduring issues such as economic and racial inequality, which some would argue are just as bad right now. How does this president create a more lasting moral imperative on this issue that Americans will still listen to?
That, of course, is something I'm sure they're talking about in the White House every single moment, because the COVID crisis will pass. It will have left a lot of scars and a lot of damaged and lives and deaths in its wake, but it will pass. They're clearly in this. One of the things that everybody said about the State of the Union address was how ambitious its scope was, how many things Biden would like to push through Congress, most of which won't get through unless there's some serious change in the next election, particularly in the Senate. But still, he's outlined a very, very ambitious program. And I think the part of it that where he has the most potential traction, the most potential leverage, is when he talks about the need for government to become seen as less the enemy of the American people than as their agent, their embodiment of what we, the people, want to do and what we need to do to become a stronger, healthier nation. But he has work to do on that regard, I think, because one of the secrets of the Republican Party wasn't particularly Trump's secret, but the secret of the party that he essentially took over in a kind of hostile takeover. But the heart that remained was this sense that government is the enemy of private affairs. That taxation is bad. Government is a bad word. Government schools, government taxation, government bureaucrats are all out to get you. And he has to turn that around. And I think he can. But that's one of the most important things that I hope that he will continue to lean into as he wants to move away from the COVID crisis. How, in fact, public investment, public action, public response to emergency really did what markets can't do, what individuals alone can't do.
And that, I wonder if people recall that that's a much bigger task, I would think, than, because it wasn't just over the last 4 years that occurred. I mean, Ronald Reagan, famous for saying that, it was the government was the problem, basically. So how much work does this take for this president? Because it didn't start 4 years ago. It started a much longer period of time ago.
That's correct. It's very, very deep since the Reagan era. On the other hand, Americans live with government. They like police forces. They are not interested in abolishing the police. They're willing to pay high taxes for the most powerful armed forces in the world, even if they don't like dead-end wars. They by and large send their children to public schools, and though they carp about public schools and they wish they were better, there's no move to end public schooling. The trick that Biden will have to do is to help people remember that government is, as he said, the agent of what we do together. And there are things we do together that in terms of helping people make lives that are valuable lives, but also this human person power issue that he brought up. If women in the workforce can't succeed, can't do what they are capable of doing because they're can't do that and take care of small children at the very same time, can't get pregnancy leave, then all of us suffer. He's going to make that point, and he has to make that point. If people at the very, very top are scooping up all of the wealth that is being produced in America, the nation can't flourish. And that's something that only all of us together can do. And that's the rhetoric, which I hope he will push along with the individual practical things he wants. He needs to talk about what we do together. And then if I could just say one little quick thing, he needs to remind people that taxation is important, but taxation has to be progressive taxation. It has to make the rich pay their fair share, which since the Reagan administration, the idea that taxation was going to create jobs by making wealthy people more wealthy because they were the job makers. That's simply not true. They use their money for all kinds of things, but they don't use the money to employ more people. And we need to reverse that understanding.
We've been waiting many lifetimes for trickle-down economics to actually work. And I'm fairly certain that at this point we can probably say that it won't.
Yeah, and he needs to say it doesn't. The Laffer curve was a myth. The idea that tax cuts pay for themselves, tax cuts are about shaping the society we want to live in.
Absolutely. Daniel Rodgers, historian, professor emeritus at Princeton University, author again of several books, including Age of Fracture, joining us again today on the America's Democrats podcast. Dan, appreciate your time with us as always. Would love to do it again soon.
So would I. Okay, take care.
Thank you. Take care. And this is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. We want you to sit back and listen, but we need you to stand up and fight. Help get our party back to its roots and to success at the ballot box. Make your contribution to keep the americasdemocrats.org podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats, on the air, and help elect stand-up Democrats. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page. This is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. And now Bill Press with Washington Post reporter David Farenthold on the state of play with Donald Trump's growing legal jeopardy.
It looks like Donald Trump could be in serious legal jeopardy. Is he?
Well, there's no charges filed yet and no lawsuits filed yet. But what I can tell you is that two different authorities in New York, the New York State Attorney General and the Manhattan DA, are doing investigations of Trump's finances that are unlike any that have come before. They have more data, they have more interviews, they have spent more time than anybody ever has understanding if Trump broke the law as a private businessman. So I don't know if he's going to have any legal consequences for this, but I do feel confident saying that when this is over, we're not going to be able to say, oh man, if we just looked, I bet you'd find a lot of this or that. You know, somebody's looked now. We just don't quite know what they found.
Okay, so last week, the New York Attorney General, Letitia James, announced that her investigation, which had been a civil investigation, was being increased to given the level of a criminal investigation. Why the change, and what does that mean?
She did not specify the evidence that caused her to make that change. But when we talked to people who have worked in the New York AG's office before, they said that they did this sometimes. It's not that common, but it happens sometimes that a civil investigation becomes a criminal one. And that generally what causes that is evidence of intent. So the simple way to understand this is that a civil case, you can sue somebody and say, look, I found that you did the wrong thing. I don't know why you did it or if you meant to do it, but I'm suing you because you broke the rules. A criminal case is, I know you did the wrong thing, and I know you knew it too, but you did it anyway. I have evidence that shows your intent. And so that's generally the kind of evidence that makes them turn a civil case into a criminal one.
And do we know what she is looking into? I mean, is she examining things that Trump may have done as president or before he became president?
To our knowledge, it's only things that happened before he was president. So last August, the AG laid out a lot of her case in a court filing, saying that she was focused on like 5 or 6 different transactions that Trump did, where she thinks might have lied about his net worth or the value of his properties. And that would be either to convince a lender that he was a better credit risk than he actually was, or to convince taxing authorities that he was worth less or his properties were worth less than they actually were. That he misled those two sets of authorities to get better financial deals. I think also since then she's shown interest in the taxing and the perks given to Alan Weisselberg, Trump's CFO, and Alan's son Barry, who was also a Trump org employee.
Right. So the one case that you mentioned, or the idea that he may have inflated the value of his properties when he was trying to get some bank loans and deflated them when he was paying his taxes. Michael Cohen, his own lawyer for 14 years or so, testified that was the case in front of Congress.
That's right. The wild thing about this is both of these investigations stem from a really unlikely place, which is Stormy Daniels. So Stormy Daniels in 2016 makes this allegation that she'd had an affair with Trump years earlier. Michael Cohen pays her off to keep her silent in the last days of the election. That leads to Cohen getting criminally charged, which leads to Cohen turning on Trump and spilling all his secrets. And that's what creates these investigations. So it was Stormy Daniels and then Michael Cohen that set all this off.
Right. And is it focused, do we know, on Trump himself or on Trump Inc.? In other words, is he personally the target of these investigations?
I think the answer is both. I mean, Trump owns the Trump Organization. It's a very small company with only one real decision maker, which is him. So you really can't investigate the company without investigating him. I think the key question will be, if you're going to make a criminal charge against Donald Trump, either the AG or the DA, you're going to have that intent that I talked about earlier. Evidence showing that Donald Trump knew what he was doing was wrong and he did it anyway. And, in a normal company where the executives use email, you can often use email to make that case. Look, this email proves this executive knew what he was doing. Trump doesn't use email. And so you're going to have to find other documents he signed or better witnesses like Cohen or Weisselberg, if he ever flipped against Trump, to say, Trump told me X, and I have evidence of his intent because I talked to him.
I keep hearing references to this Seven Springs property.
This is such a funny thing to be a problem for Trump because it's such a minor part of his life. So he owns this estate. It actually used to belong to the Graham family, the Eugene Meyer, the original one of the owners of the Washington Post years ago. Trump bought it, and he rarely visits. It's this huge estate in Westchester County, New York. And the question was, in 2015, Trump had tried to develop housing on it. He wanted to chop this thing up and make it into houses, and basically couldn't get permission from the local towns to do it. And so instead he does this thing where he gets a conservation easement. He tells the IRS, look, I have agreed not to build houses on this property, and I'm sacrificing a huge amount of potential value, and so I should get a tax break for that. He claims a $21 million tax break for giving up the supposed development value of this property. The problem for Trump is that he didn't actually have the right to develop on that property. The value he was claiming to have foregone, he didn't actually have in hand at all. So that seems to be a focus of both the DA and the Attorney General. Did Trump blatantly mislead the taxing authorities in claiming to have given up value that he didn't really have?
Right. Is there anybody else, or I would say who else in the Trump Organization could be a target of this investigation? Do we know? You've mentioned a couple of people already. Yeah, we
have some idea. So Alan Weisselberg, Trump's CFO, basically sees every dollar that goes in and out. It's unlikely that any of the transactions that are being scrutinized, tax transactions or these sorts of real estate transactions or loans, would be done without Alan Weisselberg's knowledge and approval. So he's a very important figure. Also, Trump's son, Eric, his middle son, who has been kind of the most involved in running the business in the last few years. Eric was involved in getting the assessment that allowed them to get that tax break on Seven Springs. And Eric, unlike his father, does use email.
And he's testified, correct?
Yeah, Eric has been interviewed by the New York AG. Happened last October.
Mm-hmm. How about Ivanka?
Ivanka, to our knowledge, has not been that involved in this. Ivanka was really involved in the Trump business at this point, but not in these parts of the Trump businesses. She was involved in sort of building hotels and designing hotels, and it doesn't seem like hotel transactions really have much, so far at least, haven't really been in the spotlight.
Mm-hmm. I saw that Alan Weisselberg's ex-daughter-in-law is cooperating with this investigation.
That's also one of these strange turns of fate that really affected this investigation. Alan Weisselberg's son, Barry, who was a longtime manager at the ice rink that Trump owns or operates in Central Park, he and his wife get divorced, and it's a very bitter divorce. And his ex-wife, has gone to the media as well as to the DA and the Attorney General to say, look, we got all these free benefits from the Trump Organization. So they got this free apartment that they lived in on Central Park South, this really beautiful apartment in a Trump operated building. They got other benefits that she thinks that they did not pay taxes on. Basically, that as a part of his employment with the Trump Organization, her husband, who was Alan Weisselberg's son, was getting all these extra fringe benefits, and he wasn't being taxed on it like he should have. That seems to be a focus of both the DA and the AG, and they may see it as a way to pressure Alan Weisselberg. I don't think Barry Weisselberg knows much of anything, but Alan Weisselberg knows a lot, and if he can be convinced to turn on Trump in order to save himself or his son, that would be very valuable to the DA.
Now, what is the difference between, or what is the connection between Letitia James, New York Attorney General, her investigation, and the criminal investigation that's been underway by Cyrus Vance, a Manhattan DA, for at least 3 years, right?
It's odd that these two independent authorities have been doing such similar investigations. The way to think about this is, for a long time, they really had different focuses or different methods. The Attorney General's investigation started later in 2019, but it moved much faster. It did that because she was very targeted. She didn't want to see everything that Trump had ever done. She focused on 5 or 6 different transactions, interviewed witnesses, gathered documents, got some cooperation from the Trump Organization. And it seemed like in August of last year, she was almost done. She went to a judge at that point and said, look, I'm almost done, but there's some documents that Trump Org has they won't give me, and I want you, the judge, to tell them to give them to me. Mm-hmm. So she was targeted and fast. The DA started earlier, but took this different approach where he was sort of like, let's drain the ocean. Let's get everything. Well, I want 8 years of Trump's tax returns. And he was willing to fight with Trump to the Supreme Court twice. And so finally, after that really long fight, he gets what he wanted, these millions of pages of tax returns, in February 2021. And so now, having gone much more slowly, he's finally gotten what he wanted, and he's trying to sort through these millions of pages. Now the two investigations seem to have kind of got to the same place. They seem to be interested in some of the same transactions and the same people, and they do seem to be cooperating. Apparently, 2 members of the Attorney General's team have now gone on to help the DA's team. I would expect some of their evidence and investigation is shared back and forth. We don't know if any charges will be filed, but I think if criminal charges are filed, the AG's people will have played some role in it. So there'll be some cooperation there.
Could they possibly merge the investigations?
I think they are merging to a small degree in that the things that the DA or the AG has found that are criminal now seem to be sort of handled by the DA's office with help from the Attorney General's office. I think in the end there will be 2 investigations, and we could see 2 different sets of legal action. There could be a criminal charges filed by the DA and a separate civil action filed by the Attorney General. In general, it appears that if that's going to happen, the criminal charges will come first and the civil charges afterward.
Do you have any sense of how important the tax returns, how important a role that they have played? There was a long time that people were demanding his tax returns, which at one time he promised to release and then never did. Are they key to this investigation, do you believe?
They're certainly key to the DA's investigation. I think the DA basically built his whole case around them. And he's had them since February. His people have been going through, along with the help of these forensic accountants that they hired. We don't really have any idea what they found. The DA does not make very many public filings, hasn't said almost anything publicly about, did he find anything. So we're kind of in the dark about that. You hear people who've talked to that office. Some people say, well, they're really focused and they're going to file charges, I think, in the next couple of months. And then you talk to other people who say, no, they seem like they're just at the beginning of this, understanding this mountain of data, and it'll be months and months before they decide. So I really have no idea what their timeline is.
Well, yeah, that was my next question: is when is this all going to wrap up? Now, Cyrus Vance has announced that he is retiring by the end of the year, right?
That's right. So he's not running for re-election. He'll leave, I think in New York City switches over maybe on January 1. So I do think that he will make a decision about this to charge or not charge before the end of the year, before he leaves office. This is sort of one of the signature things that Cy Vance has done as the DA, and I doubt that he would want to just hand it over to his successor without having made some sort of judgment about what he has.
And the fact that it's taken so long, is it because Trump would not release his tax returns, or
that's my reading of this?
Yeah, go ahead.
The Attorney General can't do anything until the DA decides, because civil would just generally follow criminal action. And the DA's investigation is taking so long because they chose to fight over the tax returns, and Trump used a court fight to delay them by 18 months. So they're now where they wanted to be in the beginning of 2020. They're just getting there now. So I think that's the main reason for the delay.
Right. I saw this week, I believe, in The Atlantic, or maybe it's the Bulwark, that conservative legal commentator Kim Whaley, if that's how you pronounce her name, she said that there's a possibility that we could see criminal charges filed against a former president of the United States, maybe even resulting in time in prison. Is that in the cards, do you think?
It certainly seems like a possibility. I mean, I don't think that the DA would have done this 3-year criminal investigation if he didn't think that that was a possibility. That doesn't mean it's going to happen. I feel like we are all reminded of the experience of the Mueller investigation, where for years people on the outside would say, "Oh, this is Trump's going to jail," or Trump's going to get all these horrible consequences for him, and then basically nothing happened. Trump is not the president anymore. He doesn't have the control of the Justice Department. He has less tools to fight this investigation with. But I think that experience should make us wary that just because there's a long-running investigation of somebody, there's no guarantee that they're going to be charged or go to jail. That said, that possibility is open, certainly for now.
Bill Press with Washington Post reporter David Farenthold. If you'd like to hear the entire episode, visit BillPressPods.com. And that's all for the America's Democrats podcast. Thank you to all who made today's show possible. John Lawrence, Daniel T. Rodgers, and the entire Bill Press team. And thank you for listening. If you liked what you heard, please get involved in our efforts to keep this show going and to elect Democrats who are bringing the party back to its roots. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page. And be sure to find 21st Century Democrats on Facebook and Twitter, and leave us a review on your favorite podcast app. For the America's Democrats podcast, I'm your host, Jim Cuddy. We want you to sit back and listen, but we need you to stand up and fight. Join us. Support the americasdemocrats.org podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats, and help elect Democrats who will stand up for democratic principles with your contribution today. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page.